Welcome to this special Substack Live edition of Footnotes. Let's talk about the fact that Donald Trump and his regime will be in office in 2026, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which many view as the nation's birthday. Once I realized that Trump and his regime would be in office for this significant anniversary, I started to get worried. Why? Because any anniversary like this is going to have us looking back to the past and revisiting history. And with this president, with his regime behind them, that's not going to be a good thing. They are not committed, to say the least, to accurate historical truth telling. So I had been mulling for weeks, if not months, what my response would be, both as a Christian and as a historian. Because as a historian, of course, I'm concerned with the academic discipline of history and telling history well and truthfully and according to the standards of the academy and the guild. But as a Christian, I was also concerned. Why? Because white Christian nationalism is part of this historical myth making and propagandizing, and many white Christian nationalists are now in the White House and in this regime. We can think of Pete Hegseth, we can think of Mike Johnson, we can think of so many, on and on and on. So it was one of those things. Like here's a reminder. As we look at the news going from bad to worse, it can easily seem like the powers and principalities of this world are hard at work. But you know what? Here's the other thing. The Holy Spirit is hard at work too. The Holy Spirit is hard at work in you. The Holy Spirit is hard at work in me. And the way that I think the Spirit was moving a few weeks ago was that it led me to do something, to launch something before I really knew what it was or what it was going to be. And that's a word to you. You may only know the next step and you don't know how it's all going to unfold, but take that step and watch the path emerge before you. That's what I did when I launched Conscience of the State, a faithful response to the Christian nationalist war on history. This is a year-long campaign designed to go head to head with the lies, the whitewashing, the propagandizing that we fully expect from this regime as we look toward the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. So that phrase, conscience of the state, it comes from a Martin Luther King Jr. quote, and I'll read it to you. The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. Doesn't that resonate with you, that phrase, conscience of the state? King is saying the church isn't the master of the state. We shouldn't control the state, i.e., a theocracy. That's not the role of the church, nor is the church the servant of the state to do the bidding of politicians or whatever party or leader happens to be in power. The church is neither the master of the state nor the servant of the state. The church is the conscience of the state. And I wanted to have this campaign as a way to be the conscience of the state by historical truth telling in the face of historical myth making. And this is a war on history, but not some abstract. There are actors here, namely white Christian nationalists. Okay. So that's the campaign. It's a year-long campaign. It's including articles. I've already got 3 or 4 articles out now, and I linked to the previous ones in it. So if you're not subscribed to my Substack, go there, subscribe at jemartisby.substack.com. But guess what, folks? We are already seeing the Christian nationalist war on history play out in a number of ways. So I'm going to talk about the Christian nationalist war on history, specifically Prager University, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of ways that that is manifesting itself, including this uh, letter to the Smithsonian about a review of Smithsonian exhibitions, and then lastly, if we have time, and I really am not rushing toward it because I'm sick of talking about this man, Douglas Wilson and white Christian nationalism. So let's get into it. All right. So number one, I have Substack articles on all of this. JemarTisby.substack.com. All of this is this week. It is August 14th. Can you imagine? Please, please, please prepare yourselves mentally, spiritually, emotionally for this to get worse as we get closer to July 4th, 2026. We're already seeing this. All right, so let's start with there's this partnership with Prager University, which is not a university. And they tell this on the website. They proudly are not a university because that would mean they were subject to government oversight and standards of academia. No, they're essentially a website. I saw one article call them a conservative content mill, which I think is pretty accurate. And their bread and butter are these like 5 minute videos, explainer videos on all kinds of topics from politics to culture. And it's a very slanted view. I'll get to that in a moment. But here's where it gets really dangerous. So they're already out there. They're funded to the millions of dollars. You know, conservatives, if it's something they like, they will fund the mess out of it. The White House has partnered with Prager University. Specifically, they've partnered with them as part of the America 250 initiative. Prager University is producing, quote, the Founders Museum Road to Liberty. The Founders Museum Road to Liberty. So this is in a building, a government building in Washington, D.C. They have all of these portraits of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, all white men, many of whom were slaveholders. And here's the creepy part. There's a QR code next to each portrait that you can scan, and there is an AI animation of these signers, each of whom gives a brief lesson about democracy or the nation's founding. That's already up. They had a launch event. If you go to my Substack article, there's a link to the launch event. Linda McMahon, Secretary of Ed, they're all just spouting eloquently about how great this is, and it's propaganda, and it's in the White House. So check this out. It's the Eisenhower Executive Building specifically, and the history presented obviously is very slanted. So Thomas Jefferson is one of the portraits. You scan the QR code, and you can look at these videos online too. And one of the quotes from Jefferson said he's talked about an empire of liberty. Whenever you use the word empire in a positive sense, especially from a former president or a signer of the Declaration of Independence, is not the flex you think it is to call it an empire, even an empire of liberty, which depended on other people's bondage. But here we go. Here's a quote from that AI vision portrait of Jefferson, which is really creepy, by the way, because the eyes don't move. The eyes are kind of looking off, but the face is talking to you. Just yeah, just don't go there. This AI version of Jefferson says, we must guard liberty with learning. For freedom depends not on force, but on the cultivation of an enlightened mind. The irony, the hypocrisy. We must guard liberty with learning. This coming from the regime that is banning books, that is handing down orders to Smithsonian history museums and saying, we're going to look at all of your exhibits and basically censor them for messages that we want. And the audacity, the unmitigated gall to say we must guard liberty with learning, for freedom depends not on force. Oh, thanks, Jefferson. Freedom depends not on force. Tell that to ICE. Tell that to the agents that the president deployed be outside of the press conference that Governor Gavin Newsom gave today to announce that California would launch an initiative to redistrict and gerrymander its state in response to Texas gerrymandering its state for Republicans at the behest of the president. It's not by force. Tell that to the masked agents abducting people off the street. And it says, but on the cultivation of an enlightened mind. Um, Somebody tell me the last book the president read, because surely the leader, the political leader of our nation is an enlightened mind, right? So the hypocrisy there. But it goes on, y'all. So Dennis Prager founded Prager University in 2009. He's a conservative talk radio show host. We are getting entertainers, professional right-wing entertainers as politicians and Secretary of Defense and all of these things. Dennis Prager's another one of these. He co-founded with somebody. In the 2024 annual report for Prager University, here's what he said in his letter in the annual report. He said, everything the left touches, it destroys. Everything the left touches, it destroys. That includes our shared vision of America. Our is doing a lot of work here, isn't it? Our shared vision. Whose shared vision, Mr. Prager? We can't let this happen, he says. We can't let up. There is too much at stake. So you know what the right is doing? Do you know what organizations like PragerU are doing? They are doubling down. They are doubling down on the misinformation because you know what the right understands? Momentum. They've got the White House. They've got a slim majority in both houses of Congress. They've got several super majorities at the state level, Republican governors. They said they're saying this is our moment. We can't let the left destroy our shared vision of America, so we can't let up. Okay, Dennis, it's on then. You can't let up. I'm not going to let up either. The best solution to bad history is true history. So bring it on. Conscience of the state. Here's the right-wing agenda that PragerU pushes in all of its content. And we're going to get to the fact that they're pushing this out to kids too. PragerU videos reduce history to a partisan caricature. I'm looking over here because my notes are over here, y'all. I wanted you to have I wanted you to have Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker in the background. Okay. By the way, that's at the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party rally where they're fighting for the very democracy that we're losing at this moment. I also wanted you to see Justice Takes Sides. The Democrats were always the bad guys. This is the PragerU agenda. The founders were unimpeachable moral heroes. They want to argue slavery is overblown. And if you think I'm exaggerating, ooh, just wait a couple of minutes. I'm going to get to that. Slavery is overblown. Indigenous dispossession is exaggerated. And inequality is due to cultural deficiencies in BIPOC groups and not racism. Y'all, I wish I had more time, but I'm not going to keep you too long because I could go through point by point and tear all this stuff down. But let's just focus on a couple. Like slavery is overblown. All right. So I think it was either today or it was yesterday. Courier News posted on their Instagram page a clip from an animated video that PragerU Kids did. So they have PragerU, but they have a kids division, which is genius because if you want to get eyeballs on something, make it for kids. I think if you go to like the most watched Netflix shows, most of them are kids shows like Bluey or stuff like that. So it's hitting their audience. And so they have this video about Columbus for kids in which Columbus says slavery was better than death. No, verbatim. That's what he says. Slavery is better than death. No, it's like this kid from the present time goes in the past or something and is talking to Columbus and says, what about slavery? And he's like, well, everybody was doing it and it was better than the alternative, right? They could have died. That's what they're teaching. I'm going to do either a social media post or a full article because the whole video, the several minutes of it is chock full of mistruths and misleading whatever, right? But that's just one. That's the one that got clipped that everybody's sharing. It's on my Instagram page too. So go there and you can see the whole carousel that I wrote about. Here's the problem. Slavery was better than death. No. It goes on to say, don't judge people of the past by today's moral standards. The whole men of their time argument, right? That's all embedded in there. I wrote a rebuttal on social media that says slavery was better than death. No. And I said, well, why don't we ask the enslaved people? Why don't we get the perspective of the people who were actually experiencing slavery, not the ones imposing slavery on people? And there's a Negro spiritual called "Oh Freedom." The most well-known line of that spiritual is, "And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go to my Lord and be free. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go to my Lord and be free." Do you hear that? Enslaved people are saying, no, it is actually better to die than to be enslaved. And that's not just a song. So I've been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And by the way, if you haven't been, go as soon as you can before they censor and whitewash the history. Somebody joking slash not joking said they gonna have to shut down the whole museum if they want to whitewash history, because every part of Black history in some way, shape, or form is a rebuttal of white supremacy, which is the part this regime doesn't want you to look at. So I went there and I took a photograph. This is years ago. I didn't know any of this was coming. This is before the second Trump presidency. And I took a picture of this quote on the wall. It was a excerpt from a journal article by a slave ship captain in 1694, a long time ago, before the Declaration, right? This slave ship captain says, "We had about 12 Negroes did willfully drown themselves, and others starved themselves to death. For 'tis their belief that when they die, they return to their own country and friends." So these poor, unfortunate souls have been kidnapped from their country. They're on the Middle Passage. Several of them found a way to jump off the ship and drown themselves rather than be enslaved, believing that in death they would return home. Others of them starved themselves to death. I don't know about you, but I would have to hate life so much to starve myself to death. I love food. I hate being hungry. I'm one of those people who gets hungry and angry, hangry. But the prospect of their lifelong enslavement or whatever was going to befall them after this ship voyage and being kidnapped was so onerous that they would rather refuse to eat and thereby kill themselves through starvation than to be enslaved. I'll leave you with one more mic drop on this point. Killmonger. You remember Black Panther? Sorry to spoil it for you if you haven't seen it. It's been like 5 or 6 years now. Um, he dies in the end. And in his death scene, T'Challa says, well, maybe we can save you. And he says, why? So you can put me in prison forever? And his final line is this: nah, bury me in the ocean with my ancestors that jumped from the slave ships because they knew death was better than bondage. Mic drop. So, animated PragerU Columbus video. Was slavery really better than death to the enslaved? By the way, this is why history and historians are important, because we go back to the primary sources and we look at what the actual historical actors said and did, not just our political partisan propaganda agenda, which, by the way, have you noticed that every accusation is a confession? Have you noticed that with this regime, everything they're accusing their enemies of is stuff that they're actually practicing? So the president orders federal troops, takes over the local law enforcement in Washington, D.C., and claims lawlessness. And you've seen the commentary going around that the most law breaking that's going on in Washington, D.C. is going on in the White House. And it's true. Every accusation is a confession, right? Um, this stuff with history. They're saying that it is a slanted, liberal, woke agenda that's not telling the true story and that's dividing people and is taking away the shared vision of America. Actually, their whitewashing, propagandizing, and mythologizing of history is doing the very thing they're accusing the museums of. Every accusation is a confession. It goes on. So let's talk about this. Uh, just in the past week, there was issued, you can look it up, it's called Letter to the Smithsonian, Internal Review of Smithsonian Exhibitions and Materials. I want to quote to you from this. From this letter, which was addressed to Lonnie G. Bunch, who is the founding curator of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Black men. It says this: as we prepare to celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding, it is more important than ever that our national museums reflect the unity, progress, and enduring values that define the American story. In this spirit, and in accordance with Executive Order 14253, Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, we will be leading a comprehensive internal review of selected Smithsonian museums and exhibitions. Let me pause. There are more than 30, there's around 36 Smithsonian museums. They're reviewing 9 of them, 8 or 9 of them, and you can guess which ones. It's all of the ones that talk about Black people, indigenous people, women, all the usual suspects in terms of who they deem enemies. That's why it says select museums and exhibitions. And it goes on to say this initiative aims to ensure alignment with the president's directive. First of all, the museums are not supposed to be worried about being in alignment with the president's anything. These museums are curated by academic historians who are concerned about alignment with high historical standards. The president's directive to celebrate American exceptionalism, if you know anything about the study of history, American exceptionalism is not a positive phrase. American exceptionalism refers not to being exceptionally good. In the historical discipline, American exceptionalism refers to the view of history that the United States has this uninterrupted march toward progress and freedom and liberty, and it downplays anything that would take away from that narrative, like slavery or genocide or convict leasing or segregation or internment, or you can name it. So American exceptionalism is not a good thing, but it shows how historically ignorant they are because they're including it in this letter to the Smithsonian. Remove divisive or partisan narratives. That's what they want to do. Every accusation is a confession. And restore confidence in our shared cultural institutions. Who's not confident in our shared cultural institutions like Smithsonian museums? How many of y'all are sitting around saying, I'm not confident in the history told in these museums on the National Mall? It ain't y'all. Who is it? The president, his regime, right-wing acolytes who only want to think of America as good and glorious and who do not have patriotism for the country, but nationalism, because patriotism loves the nation enough to tell the truth about it. Nationalism hides from the truth in order to embrace a lie. That's a bar. Somebody write that down. Patriotism or nationalism, no, patriotism loves the nation enough to tell the truth about it. Nationalism hides from the truth in order to embrace a lie. That's just off the dome. Let me tell you why this is really about white Christian nationalism. I'm going to bring this full circle. White Christian nationalism requires a virtuous past to sell its story of U.S. history. Let me tell you again. White Christian nationalism requires a virtuous past to sell its story of U.S. history. Now, what is the white Christian nationalist story of U.S. history? Number one, the United States was founded as a Christian nation by Christians who followed a narrow fundamentalist view of Christian morality. White Christian nationalist origin story of the United States also says that the U.S. is specially blessed by God. Of all the nations of the earth, the United States is just God's baby, God's special little country. And that's because, and it's been blessed by God partly because back in the good old days when America was great, people followed Christian principles. This is the origin story that white Christian nationalists are telling. And in order to get back to those great American days, we have to get back to following this view of Christianity they had. That's why Douglas Wilson, who I'll end up talking about in a second, he's saying he wants a Christian nation. But here's the thing. This mythic, glorified, invented past falls apart if history is honest. It disintegrates in the light of truth. It falls apart like a vampire in sunlight. But rather, white Christian nationalists, rather than changing their theology to fit the facts, they would rather change the facts to fit their theology. So understand, all of this is connected in some way, shape, or form to white Christian nationalism, because in inventing this mythical origin story of the United States, they have to deny or downplay certain facts, which is how you get a PragerU Kids video of Columbus saying slavery was better than death. All right. We're landing the plane. Let me tell you about one other white Christian nationalist occurrence now. Douglas Wilson. How to describe him? He is a far-right extremist Christian dominionist. We should be talking more about Christian dominionism and Seven Mountains dominionism. But in a recent CNN article in which he was profiled, they called him a Christian nationalist. And that's a label he proudly claims. Now, what is pernicious about Douglas Wilson is his theology, which is hyper patriarchal, which just, if you just watch the interview, it oozes out. And then his racially backwards view, in which the way he tries to explain slavery, which he'll vehemently deny, he's not in support of slavery, but the way he tries to explain it is, well, only a small number of white people were actually slaveholders, and probably the grossest abuses of slaveholders toward the enslaved are overblown. Not that they didn't happen, but that they weren't that common, and that the best form of slaveholding was embodied in Christian slaveholders. You can look up his writing. But I say all that because they just opened first of all, he's got his own fiefdom in Idaho, Moscow, Idaho. it's a whole complex of it's a church, it's businesses, buildings, all of these things. Now it's spreading its tentacles elsewhere, specifically through his church network, the Christian Reformed Evangelical Churches. So CREC. A CREC church just opened up in Washington, D.C. In the interview, he says, this is not about influencing politicians in Washington, D.C. This is just because we have a lot of supporters there and we wanted to give them a congregation. No, 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 no. He's got a plan to expand, y'all, a pernicious plan, and he's doing it quite effectively. And I wrote about this dude. First of all, I have had personal run ins with this dude. So back when we were the Reformed African American Network, the nonprofit I started, we were on their radar because we were not agreeing with his stances specifically on race, but also a host of other issues, right? And so he wrote about me several times on his blog. Most recently was I think 2021, and it was had to do with this whole Grove City College debacle. This is a far right wing conservative Christian college in Pennsylvania. They invited me to speak, and it caused this big to do. There was a whole petition about Grove City College going woke, and they used my presence there as a speaker as part of their evidence. Blah blah blah. It goes on and on. Gets to Doug Wilson, and he writes an article, and he says the good news is the faculty member behind the troublesome Jemar Tisby invitation is no longer on faculty. So just call me troublesome Jemar Tisby. And then he went on to say, just as the presence of Jemar Tisby sent an unwanted message. What message is that, Doug? That justice matters? Y'all can go back and listen to the chapel message I gave at Grove City. It is not at all fiery. I'm passionate in it, but nothing that I say is controversial. Nothing. I stand by every single word of it. Anyway, he says, just as the presence of Jemar Tisby sent an unwanted message, so also would an invitation to Vodi Bakum, for example, send a desired message. Vodi Bakum is a black man, but he's ultra white. He's also ultra right wing, far right conservative as well. And in these homeschools. By the way, what I think is actually most pernicious about Douglas Wilson and the empire he's building is his network of so-called classical Christian schools. Have you heard of classical Christian education? It's the idea that your curriculum is based on the classics. Now, there are versions of classical education that are fine. They're not troublesome. But the white Christian nationalist version, oh, it's bad news. Why? Because it is Eurocentric, or as one, I think, white identity extremist group proudly says, they are Western chauvinistic, Western chauvinists. The idea that the classics come almost exclusively out of Europe is the issue. The idea that the writings, the teachings, the government, the history out of Asia, Africa, Latin America, or any other place on the globe is not considered classic or worthy of study in the same way. That's what these classical Christian schools of the Doug Wilson brand are pushing. I'm hoping to do some more research and writing about that. To tie this all together, y'all, thanks for hanging with me, but let's tie this all together. History is not just about remembering the past. History is about shaping identity. History is not just about remembering the past. History is about shaping identity. If you can control the historical narrative, you can control how an individual, a people, or a nation thinks about its identity. What this Christian nationalist war on history is about shaping history so that they can reshape identity in the present. They want to craft enough propaganda to make you believe their version of the nation's history, which is this founded as a Christian nation, blessed by God, apple of God's eye, have to be a Christian theocracy, essentially. That's the narrative they want you to believe. And if they can go to the Smithsonian, if they can have exhibits with AI videos attached to them in government buildings, if they can have animated videos geared toward children who aren't going to have any other context than what they see in these videos to be able to filter truth from lies. If they can do that, then they can reshape how we think of ourselves, how we think of ourselves as a nation. That's what's most dangerous about it. And we didn't have but a historical blip on the radar of real truth telling that centered marginalized groups like women, queer people, black people, indigenous people. That's been the movement in the historical disciplines since about the 1960s. And now all of that truth telling is being rolled back, hidden, whitewashed, covered up, erased. They want to turn back the clock. They're putting back up Confederate monuments. They're going back to military bases and putting up the names of slaveholders again. They're literally trying to push us backwards in our historical understanding, which I reiterate is not just about remembering the past, it's about shaping identity. They want to shape your identity. So, what are we going to do about it? I don't know about you, but my effort is conscience of the state, a faithful response to the Christian nationalist war on history. And I want you to be a part of it. I want you to be part of it first and foremost by subscribing to jamartisby.substack.com. Every time I see a story about this, if I have the bandwidth, I'm going to be writing about it. Or I'll be posting about it on social media. My main ones are Instagram and right here on Substack Notes. So follow me there. I also want you to look, how do I say this? I would like you to become a paid subscriber to my Substack. Thank you to those of you who are, because I have a top 10 publication in the history category. As of yesterday and today, I'm number one rising in the history category in terms of subscriptions. Thank you. But here's the thing. I'll have a lot more news to share in the coming weeks. But basically what I need to say to you is Substack's my main thing. Substack is what's keeping the lights on. Also, Substack is what is fueling my work. So I have ideas for more online courses for you. I have ideas for videos for social media. I just recorded a batch of videos yesterday on white Christian nationalism. Look for the white Christian nationalism series coming from me on my social media. But I also have ideas for documentaries and going on location places and hiring people who can run the cameras and do the audio and help me bring these visions to life. I can't do it though on my own. So if you want to push back against this white Christian nationalist war on history, one way to do it, it's $7 a month, y'all. $7 a month. You can't buy a McDonald's meal for less than $7 these days. If you get dinner or DoorDash for a couple of people, you'll pay for the whole year. So I'm just asking you for like one of those things, right? $7 a month at jamartisby.substack.com, specifically for my year-long campaign, Conscience of the State. I'm going to be doing these Substack lives more often. Please feel free to comment. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. Even your attention is part of the pushback. As we become more aware, we can push back. Lastly, if this was helpful to you, please do share it. It's going to be posted at jamartisby.substack.com. And I appreciate y'all. We'll see you at the next one.